Welcome to Talk+Water, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of water with those making waves. My name is Todd Bottler. I'm your host for Talk+Water. I'm also the editor-in-chief of Texas Water and the Texas Water Journal. If you listen to this podcast, you may recall that I spoke with Dr. Joe Underhill, the director of the river semester at Augsburg University in Minneapolis, Minnesota in 2020. Now that discussion was about a group of college students and professors starting in Minnesota and paddling all the way down the Mississippi River or over the course of a semester. So since then, I've connected with the River Field Studies Network, which is a community of practice that aims to advance undergraduate biology education and support healthy river ecosystems through inclusive, immersive, interdisciplinary, field-based education. That's how I connected with my guest today, Dr. Denielle Perry. Denielle Perry is a water resource geographer and assistant professor at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona. She's part of the School of Earth and Sustainability and is director of the Free Flowing Rivers Lab. Denielle, welcome and thank you for being part of Talk+Water.
Thank you, Todd. I'm happy to be here with you today.
Great. So let's start out with your background in water. How did you first become involved with water?
Well, I grew up in Florida on an island in a lake surrounded by rivers that flow out to the Gulf of Mexico that are home to the endangered manatee. And I used to swim with manatees as a kid growing up, and
oh my gosh,
spent my life in the water. So that's really where it started. And then I became a river guide in my teens, early 20s, and working as a river guide got me really interested in river advocacy and river research.
So where were you a river guide?
The first place I commercially guided was actually on the Rio Grande outside of Taos, New Mexico.
Okay. Interesting. Well, I've had the opportunity to get involved with a lot of discussions about the Rio Grande over the last couple of years, and you're up there near the beginning of it. I know it starts in Colorado, but it's not, I guess, too far from where you were.
No, pretty close to the headwaters. So I worked on the Rio Grande and Chama. And back then, I did some volunteer work doing restoration projects, replanting cottonwood trees on the Wild and Scenic Chama River, and learned a lot about wild and scenic policy at that point in time.
That's great. I've been there. They used to have a historic railway and train that you could take that would kind of go through some of the natural area. And it was, an old locomotive engine. And, I can't remember. I think I was maybe in high school when we did that.
It's still there. Great time of year to do it with the fall colors.
I'll bet. So tell us about the Free Flowing Rivers Lab.
All right. The Free Flowing Rivers Lab is a research lab at NAU where the graduate students, PhD students, master students, and undergraduate students and I all do research related to some aspects of rivers, whether that's looking at conservation policy or river restoration priorities. I have some associates that are part of the lab as well, other faculty who do research with the students in there. And we do all kinds of projects. So a few that just finished up was, I could talk about are looking at assessing the potential resilience of rivers to climate change here in the desert Southwest region. to understand where we should be focusing conservation efforts, because we can't protect every river. And with climate change, not every river is going to maintain its flow. Not every river is going to continue to provide the same kind of habitat for the native species. So understanding which rivers will maintain their flow and the right types of vegetative assemblages on the shores and the right kind of species diversity can really help to inform advocacy efforts as well as federal land management efforts in terms of where to focus their very limited dollars and human resources. Another study that we just completed was assessing dam sites for potential removal and river restoration in the 10 western states to also inform efforts on where to to inform conservation efforts. So once a dam is removed and a river is restored, then you can put some sort of policy on it to protect its free flow into the future. Which is really important as the climate is changing, because we have dammed and diverted most of the rivers in the West. And so one way to ensure biodiversity persists in these rivers is to actually restore those rivers.
So the Texas Water Journal published an article in 2020 about dam removals in Texas, which, there really hadn't been many. But I'm interested, where do you kind of see in terms of the trends? I read about a lot of removals that have happened in the, eastern United States and, how those rivers are coming back. But I guess I hear more of a focus on projects in the future being out west.
Yeah, you're right. Their dams are coming out all over the place. And this is the decade of restoration. So we're going to see a lot more dam removals over the course of this decade. And a lot of old dams, very old dams in the eastern United States, hundreds of years old, have been removed and those rivers restored. And now we've got dams out west that are over 100 years old, and it's time for them to come out too, because they're obsolete. They're blocking fish passage. It's not easy to retrofit those dams to add fish passage. And as we're seeing declines in really important anadromous fish species like salmon that have multi-million-dollar industries that depend on them, dam removal is one way to ensure the persistence of those species in the environment. And we've seen some dams come out in Washington State and Oregon and California for that purpose. And that there's a proposal to remove the 4 lower Snake Dam rivers in the Columbia River system to help restore the salmon runs, which in turn has some trophic cascade effects on the orcas out in the ocean. And so that type of removal can have some really impactful, positive results for the ecosystem that is pretty imperiled at this point in time. We've got to do something major there to help those fish.
Yeah, as someone who worked at a river authority for almost 2 decades, there's a tendency by water managers to look at all dams as monuments instead of tools. But there really are tools, and not every tool is still useful. And it seems logical that we have, some reevaluation of dams. And that doesn't mean that all of them are going to come out. I think that's what some folks, particularly people who are concerned about water supplies and flood control, think that means all the large dams are going to come out. But I think it's maybe more of a practical approach. I mean, I guess is a question for you. It seems like there are clearly some that really, don't serve their original purpose, and maybe not are providing that much of a benefit anymore, and removing them is a much greater benefit.
Absolutely. You really have to weigh the costs and benefits. And when you think about all the money that gets pumped into trying to mitigate the impacts of dams on species like salmon, and we're not really seeing that those efforts are benefiting the fish in the way that they were designed to do, it's actually more cost effective to take the dams out and restore the river and find other modes of transportation, which is the case in the Columbia River system. But in the case of smaller dams here, we took out an old dam on Fossil Creek in Arizona and restored the river, and then it was designated wild and scenic a couple years after, and it's now this teeming oasis in the middle of the desert where it's just brimming with wildlife, and it's a place for people to go swim. And when you live in the desert, there are very few places that you can actually enjoy those opportunities. And that dam was previously providing energy for the mining industry. And we have other types of energy now. We have wind and solar coming on the grid all the time. We have a nuclear power plant here. We don't need those old small dams. We have alternative energy sources. So as we see more of those truly green, renewable, alternative energy sources come on the grid, that's an opportunity to take out some of those old, small hydropower dams that really no longer serve their purpose.
Well, I can tell you really love rivers, and I'm guessing that's maybe why you decided to devote your career to rivers. Tell us a little bit about that, and also the kind of threats that you're most, focused on in terms of rivers.
Yeah. Well, rivers are integrators, right? They connect mountains with oceans. They move the sediment and the nutrients that are used in the floodplains to grow food. They provide habitat for all kinds of species, like I was just mentioning, and from macrobenthic invertebrates that feed the fish that the fisher people like to go out and harvest, all the way up through bears, right? And elk that depend on riverine corridors for their habitat at different parts of their life cycles. They do provide transportation routes for people, and they're places where we like to go recreate, and groups of people, indigenous peoples in particular, find their sense of spirituality, right? Their cultures are rooted in rivers. So for all those reasons, rivers are a great thing to study, and they're a great thing to protect. And some of the key threats is, because rivers are the main freshwater source for billions of people around the world, they're really highly sought after for drinking water. They're used in industry. They're used in irrigated agriculture. They're used for energy production. And those uses are often in conflict with biodiversity and cultural uses. And with so many people depending on the water, there's often conflicting reasons, right? The lack of integrated planning and management for rivers is probably the biggest threat that we have in our river systems, because you have all those competing uses and people are not talking across the table about how to balance out the ecological needs with the social needs and the economic needs. And especially when you take into consideration that climate change is changing the availability of water in our rivers, the timing and the quantity and even the quality of water in the rivers, that lack of integrated planning is probably the biggest threat.
So, okay, switching from rivers to the River Field Study Network, tell me what that is.
Okay, so RIVER stands for the River-Based Immersive Education and Research Field Studies Network. And this is an NSF-funded research collaboration network for undergraduate biology education. And the purpose of the network is to transform education through these immersive interdisciplinary river and watershed programs. And specifically, we are expanding the network to communicate and coordinate research and training and educational activities across all kinds of boundaries. So across disciplinary boundaries between biologists, ecologists, geologists, geographers, etc., between organizational boundaries, different types of institutional boundaries, and even geographic boundaries. The idea is to collaborate across the country between academics and nonprofits and river managers to address all sorts of different concerns in being able to offer field-based courses so that we can train the next generation of river professionals, river scientists.
So, in my background, when I was in graduate school, I spent a summer at the University of Michigan Biological Station in northern Michigan. And, had a chance there, and also at I was at the Duke Marine Lab too for one summer. So I had a lot of experience at one point with field studies, and really thought that they were a great way to educate. So why don't you tell us what you think are important about field studies?
Yeah, well, and there's nothing better than being in a place and getting your hands dirty or wet in the case of rivers and getting that experiential education. Learning from a textbook is fine, but when you get into the field, you're actively learning through these immersive experiences. And this is what students really need to be able to transform them into actual scientists who have on the ground practical experience and an understanding of the world around them.
Well, I have heard that field studies are in decline in America, and I guess maybe that's even before the pandemic came along. So I'm just curious about that. What do you think's causing that?
Oh, there's a lot of different aspects that factor into why we don't have the resources necessary to offer field courses as much as we did in the past. There's a lack of funding. The funding isn't prioritized for getting students in the field. I mean, there's transportation costs associated with that. There's risk assessment. Universities have become very risk averse. There's administrative red tape. There's faculty that just don't have the time. They would like to offer the courses. And so all those things together can really be deterrents for being able to offer these types of experiences. And yet these are the key experiences that these students really need to set them apart, to prepare them for the real world, for the job market, for understanding the field that they're trying to be professionals in.
And so the River Field Studies Network, I guess, is in part designed to help with, I guess, overcoming some of those obstacles that are in the way of universities spending more time and effort on field studies.
Yes, absolutely. So, we have 6 broad objectives with our network. The first one is building instructor capacity for river field studies. So we did a national survey to understand, where are people offering courses where they're taking students into the field in some way to work on or around rivers, whether they're just going there for a few hours or they're spending multiple days on the river, like the trip that you were discussing earlier. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. We found that there are hundreds of classes being offered across the country. And actually, while field studies might be in decline, there are more river-based courses being offered all the time because people understand that we really do need to study our rivers. And so one of the objectives is to train a new group of instructors every year in how to offer a river field course. We already have developed educational materials for this network that we're actually making available online on our website. So it will be they're open source materials that anyone who wants to offer a field course can go to the website and download those materials. And so one of our objectives is actually to develop these materials and curate them in perpetuity. Another objective is to broaden participation in field studies and river field studies. So it's well known that the STEM fields are not very diverse in terms of the faculty who are teaching the courses, all the way down to the students who feel empowered to take those courses and pursue those careers. And so we are trying to diversify participation in field studies by making it more inclusive, more accessible to people who have different physical abilities, and training instructors on this type of inclusive pedagogy and using technology even to help people access rivers that might not otherwise be able to do so. We're building partnerships with different organizations and communities to help promote inclusion. We've got all kinds of exciting opportunities coming along in that realm. On our website, you can find a whole catalog of information, webinars, articles, trainings on grant funding for people who are interested in field studies or teaching field studies to make them inclusive. But another objective is promoting safety in the field. And so by doing risk assessment and teaching about safety, when rivers are moving water and it has a whole different level of risk associated with it. And so we are training instructors on river safety and eventually we will be providing materials that are training materials on our website. Obviously, we have a website, which is housing all of this infrastructure, and that's another one of our objectives. And then assessing our work and assessing other field studies so that we can constantly improve them. And the aim is that through this network, we can work collectively to help institutions understand the need for these types of courses and try to expand the offering of field courses instead of continuing with that trend of seeing field courses decline.
So I imagine as an advocate for field study courses, you could probably think of some moment when it kind of clicked for your students, when you had them out in the field and it was a great example for yourself that, hey, I'm reaching these students in a way that it's hard to do in the classroom.
Absolutely. I teach a part of a course that I teach. It's an introductory environmental sustainability course, and mostly freshmen take them out into the Flagstaff area every year to teach them about Flagstaff's water, past, present, and future. And we don't have a lot of rivers here, but we have perennial streams, but we have a lot of ephemeral stream channels here. And we rely on those to provide water to the city of Flagstaff. And so thinking about that water bottle that they're filling up at their faucet in the morning or in the water fountain in the hallway on campus, and then going out into the forest and seeing these ephemeral stream channels and how some of them are degraded and how some of them are being restored so that they can continue to filter water into our local reservoir, which is Lake Mary, where the city of Flagstaff gets its drinking water. And the students see that connection between the forest and the stream beds and that reservoir and then their tap, and they're like, wow, I never really thought about where my water is coming from, and all of the process between getting it from the lake to the water treatment facility through the pipes into their sink is a real aha moment for people who might have grown up in a city and have no idea that their water is coming from these forests high in the mountains.
Kind of as our last major question here, I'm interested in what you think about the potential that field studies and this kind of experiential learning can have to change our relationship with rivers. And I know everybody thinks about, really rivers in the Western United States, the Columbia and the Snake and the Colorado and all that. But just all over the country where there are rivers everywhere, right? And, programs like this at universities all over the country, to me, seem like they could really help us to change how we look at our rivers.
Yeah. So, even though the grant is funded through NSF through the Undergraduate Biology Education Directorate, I think it's, I can't think of any discipline that couldn't find some way to integrate rivers into its curriculum. I'm a geographer. I'm not a biologist. And so to say that in another way, rivers are integrators of not just the landscape, they're integrators of disciplines and people. Rivers inspire music and art and literature, and engineers dam and divert and restore rivers, and chemists study water quality, and historians think about the role of rivers in important moments in time. So bringing people from all these different various disciplines together on the river is a way to come up with interdisciplinary solutions that we need for resolving some of the many issues that are facing our rivers, from the fresh water crisis to the biodiversity crisis to pollution problems and over allocation, and which are kind of at the heart of these crises.
I recall from my interview with Joe Underhill that Augsburg actually had the English and the history department involved in their river semester trip. And so that's a direct example of what you're saying.
Absolutely. Yep. Rivers have a very important place in the history of the United States and the world. And so they are at the heart of our culture, really.
Great. Well, so let's tell our listeners, how can they find out about the Riverfield Studies Network and the Free Flowing Rivers Lab?
Well, the Riverfield Studies Network has a website. It's riverfieldstudies.com. And the Free Flowing Rivers Lab, you can find out by searching for me on the internet or looking at NAU's School of Earth and Sustainability website.
And I will add those links to the description of the podcast. So someone who's listening and didn't write that down, you could just go and look at the podcast episode description, and those links will be in there.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
Denielle, thank you for joining us today. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, I did too, Todd. Thank you for having me here.
Well, that wraps up Talk+Water. My guest today was Denielle Perry, an assistant professor at Northern Arizona University and the director of the Free Flowing Rivers Lab. I want to thank our listeners for tuning in and to say that if you enjoyed the episode today, consider giving it a like. My name's Todd Bottler. Let's talk water again soon.